Hello. So today I thought I would try to, as part of my explainers, partly this is all about explaining or trying to explain things for me as much as it is for perhaps folks out there who are very new to all of this trans stuff. I thought I'd try and um, define, or at least look at some of the accepted definitions for some of the more common terms that I use on this channel, particularly words like trans and gender dysphoria. So let's take a look at that one first of all, the term trans. And this is one where I think probably you will get a different definition from different people. It's not an entirely clearly bounded term. It means slightly different things to different, well, very different things in some cases to different people. So for some, for example, when I read a book on trans, it is solely focused on people who have a very clear um, dysphoria. They have a sense of their identity, their sense of being is very much incongruent, contrary to the body they live in and the kind of social expectations of being male or female. And therefore, the term would usually, for those people, refer to someone that either has or is contemplating transition or another way of living with this very severe dysphoria. It may be through living, as it were, with the gender expression of another, of their preferred and believed identity. For others, and this is the way I tend to use the term, trans is much more of an umbrella term that sort of really covers anything loosely attached with gender play right through to those situations, that circumstance I just described, where someone has a very clear gender identity condition. So, a broad range of identities, experiences, expressions that fall under uh, the term as I use it, and as many other people do, maybe to do with identity, maybe to do with expression or behavior that doesn't conform with the binary roles that we are assigned at birth. It also includes people like me that perhaps struggle sometimes to fit into a box of being masculine or feminine. I think I personally feel okay to sit in the box of being male in that that is my biology. That is the body I occupy, and most of the time is the way I express myself. But I do have gender dysphoria, and I do flex and feel a need, an urgent and regular need to express what I understand as being the feminine from within. So I am someone that, under my own definition, as it were, considers myself to be trans. Whether it's a spectrum or not, I've tried to cover that in another video. I'm not so sure. It tends to be the way I look at it for simplicity, kind of like a shorthand, if you like, as being some sort of spectrum. But I don't think it's necessarily quite a continuum of different expressions. Now, there are some definitions used by clinicians, and particularly one which is used by psychologists is one used by the American Psychiatric Association in their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the fifth edition of which was published back in 2013, DSM-5 for short. And this is kind of a handbook for psychologists diagnosing a wide range of conditions. And they defined transgender as an umbrella term describing individuals whose gender identity does not align in a traditional sense with the gender they were assigned at birth. It may also be used to refer to a person whose gender identity is binary and not traditionally associated with that assigned at birth. So pretty much my definition, if you like. And they go on to say that the term refers to a person whose sex assigned at birth, i.e., usually based on external genitalia does not align their gender identity, in other words, their psychological sense of their gender. Some people who are transgender will experience gender dysphoria. We'll go on to talk about what that is in just a minute, which refers to the psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. Quite a lot of detail there in the DSM about when gender dysphoria usually begins, usually in childhood. And they go on to say that people who are transgender may pursue different ways of affirming their gender, which includes social behavior, for example, changing the pronouns that you like to be known by, a legal status, changing the gender markers if you're able to in your country on passports and other government documents, medical affirmation, which may be things like during puberty, blocking the gender affirming hormones that really kick in at that time. And of course, it may also include surgical and hormonal replacement. So, one of the clear distinctions that the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, makes here is between gender identity and gender expression. Gender identity very much being a psychological condition about how someone feels and identifies, whereas gender expression is very much about how we present ourselves to the world. And perhaps sometimes that is done as a rebellion or as someone that just wants to be to stand out from the crowd or mark their own identity in some way. It's not necessarily tied in with any dysphoria or issue, as it were, around their identity. Now, there's a very well known and respected blogger, transgender activist, who goes under the pen name of Jack Mollet, who set up and maintains several very active websites, forums, monitoring the news, and offering information and links to a whole range of resources and commentaries on everything to do with trans. I'll put the links to some of those in the description for this video. They really are well worth taking a look. And I'm quite a regular, I was going to say contributor. I do contribute from time to time, but I'm quite a regular quite regularly drop into one of these, Cross Stream Life, where there is a very active, generally very respectful and intelligent, I think, dialogue on all kinds of questions related to transgender. And this is a very good forum for significant others of those who are transgendered. There's a dedicated subforum for those. There's a dedicated subforum for female to male, who are often misrepresented in this debate, transgender people. And it's a great place for anyone that considers themselves under the heading of trans to raise questions or offer views. Jack offers and again, I'll put the link to this, a glossary of terms. And again, the APA has a glossary as well. I'll put the link to that in the description as well. He defines transgender, which he does note is controversial, sometimes the shorthand TG or trans. An umbrella term applied to a variety of individuals, behaviors, and groups involving tendencies to diverge from the normative gender roles or gender experience connected to their assigned gender, including transsexuals. And there are various other definitions here that he goes on to say that people who want to live cross-gender without sex reassignment surgery, excluding transsexuals, that is a transgenderist, and cross-dreamers and cross-dressers, as opposed to classic transsexuals or HBS trans women. And finally, the word transsexual, which he I keep saying he. I do apologize to Jack if I actually don't know what pronouns he, she, or they prefers to use. So apologies if I'm getting that wrong. Later, the term increasingly used for a subset of gender diverse people whose gender identity, does not match their assigned gender and which remains persistent, consistent, and insistent over time. And this really is one of the key aspects of this idea of gender dysphoria, um, which the DSM defines both seen in, or I say both, it's seen in children, adolescents, and adults as a marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and assigned gender of at least 6 months duration. And to be diagnosed under this category, the individual must satisfy at least 2 out of 6 criteria. I'll put those on a slide. So dysphoria being distress caused by the body and mind not aligning, or it might be to do with the social experience and comfort or discomfort. It used to be called a gender identity disorder. That term's not so much used these days, where the DSM now is putting a focus on the distress that trans people experience, and therefore why they tend to seek psychiatric, surgical, other medical help, rather than on the question of identity itself. And in more recent years, there has been attention given to gender dysphoria in children. And the DSM has quite a lot to say on that matter as well. It's not a subject I know really very much about, so I won't dwell on that. So this idea that gender dysphoria is persistent, it's significant, it has real impact in terms of how people feel comfortable to lead their lives in the society in which they live, in their jobs, in their families, and in all areas really of their functioning and relating with other people. There is also in the new version of DSM reference to disorders of sex development, which is quite distinct, although often the kind of treatment that will be offered, and indeed a level of gender dysphoria, if not very significant gender dysphoria, may attach to people who have these so-called disorders, DSDs. And these are chromosome, typically, variations to normal patterns. So there's what's called Klinefelter syndrome, there's Turner syndrome, and androgen insensitivity syndrome, where the anatomical, I'm reading from the APA here, the anatomical, chromosomal, or gonadal sex varies in some way from what would be typically considered male or female. So this includes some folk who would prefer to use the term intersex. But that is something quite different, even if it's quite closely related. There's also a distinction made between gender identity and gender non-conformity. And gender non-conformity is probably referring to these folks, I guess sometimes a bit like me, who maybe a bit like to be a little bit outlandish. They like to express themselves in their own way through their dress, hairstyles, and so on. And the way they do that, and the way they behave, and the way they dress, particularly in the cultures in which they're in, may not, or very often will not, align with common expectations and understanding of so-called appropriate, a judgmental term, that one, dress and behavior. So some of the key points about gender non-conformity we can pull out. Broad term can include trans people, can include non-binary, gender fluid like myself, and cisgender, i.e. those whose gender identity does align with the body they're in, the sex they were born in. Very much about expression, presentation, rather than specifically being about a deep-rooted identity and sense of psychologically not aligning with the sex you are meant to present based on your body. Meant to. I'm using all sorts of judgmental words here, aren't I? And as we say very often, this whole idea of gender being a social construct. So it's going to vary depending on what time in history, what culture you're in, and so on, how it is expressed. So I call myself gender fluid. Another term we probably should tease out and try and offer a definition on. And this refers to a non-fixed gender identity that shifts over time, sometimes depending on a situation. So it involves a fluctuation in identity or expression or both. Gender fluid person may identify as male, female, a combination of both, or neither at different times. That's how they would see themselves. Of course, there's going to be controversy about how others see them. And their gender identity and expression can change over their lifetime, or even from day to day, as it does for me sometimes. So some say gender fluidity is different to being transgender. And this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, where a person's identity is different persistently, consistently from the sex they were assigned at birth. So possibly it's something again that lends itself to the idea of a spectrum more than boxes, more than the either this or that kind of way of defining what it's about. Other terms we should mention: cross-dressers, sometimes called transvestites, not a term used very often these days. I must admit, I don't know why, I just feel much more comfortable with the word cross-dresser. It seems to perhaps have less of the baggage, um, the judgment, social judgment that used to be associated with the term when I was growing up, transvestite, that was very widely used. Cross-dressers aren't necessarily transgender, at least in that idea of wanting to transition. In fact, most aren't. So depending on whether you take my definition of trans, the sort of umbrella, catch-all definition, or something more specific, they may not be considered transgender at all. It's an activity, a behavior, rather than necessarily to do solely with gender identity. People who dress in clothes associated with the opposite gender to that they were assigned at birth. And many cross-dressers, as I say, do not identify as trans. Many are cisgender, in other words, their gender identity matches what they were assigned at the sex were assigned at birth. And it's true to say also that not all transgender people will cross-dress. So it's not quite so clear-cut either. I don't know that I would necessarily very much if I was able to just summon up and be able to express this inner sense of the feminine and in a way that I can relate and present to the world, as it were, to be acknowledged, to be seen. Dress and so on it does play a part for me in allowing that to happen, enabling it to happen, but it's very much an aid, ultimately, a means to an end, as it were. Now, there's another really nice term that I like, which was coined by Jack Malay, cross-dreaming, which refers to the experience of imagining, fantasizing about, or expressing oneself as a gender different from one assigned at birth. So on the website crossstreamers.com, we read definition: a cross-dreamer is someone who, to a larger or smaller extent, is driven towards imagining and expressing themselves as another gender. Transgender people who have not yet transitioned often cross-dream, but people who see themselves as non-transgender or cis may also do so. So it covers a wide range of people. A term was originally coined to describe the phenomenon that some people get aroused by the idea of being the other sex, relative to the gender assigned to them at birth. Since then, the term has gained a much broader meaning, now used in reference to all kinds of cross gender expressions, dreams, fantasies, be they erotic or not. So, involves exploring, expressing gender identity or expression that differs from what society expects. And through various activities it can include, which include cross-dressing, cross-enacting, which is exploring behaviors or interests associated with another gender, and creating art and media that reflect gender expression in some way. As we've said, may include both transgender and cisgender people who engage with it. Um, it can be a way for people to affirm their gender identity before they transition. And possibly there is some sort of spectrum here again, um, and different levels of intensity, as it were, of expression. So, a little bit of a potted tour there of some of the terms that I quite commonly use, and just trying to explain how I tend to use them. As I say, not all of these will be universally recognized or accepted definitions. There are some excellent websites out there, particularly the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, and the cross-streaming portals. So I will put links to those if you want to explore in more detail.